It is the Awesemo MLB Strategy Show. Also, a little bit of talk about the early slate. Only 3 games, so just because it's only 3 games, Adam and I are going to be focusing a little bit more on the main slate, but we'll talk about the 3-game slate that starts at 2 p.m. Eastern at the top of the show. Then we're going to be getting into the main slate. But first off, Adam, how did last night's slate go for you?
Not great. I mean, the Blue Jays obviously had a good slate. They were really popular. I played them. I was in line with the field pretty much. But whenever, even if you have exposure, if the most popular team goes off, it's pretty unlikely you're going to have a really good night just because tournaments are top heavy and you're competing with a lot more teams. So didn't go too well for me. What about you?
Yeah, so I was saying right before we started, I don't know if you caught the entire thing because it was just as you were getting into Zoom. But the only thing that really saved me last night is, so for me, I bet basketball most heavily, but I still apply some of the same concepts to baseball betting that I do to NBA. So to me, the number one thing that made sense to bet for baseball last night was as soon as Domingo Germán got scratched from the start for the Yankees, I was like, oh, okay, this is an obvious spot to go bet on the Mariners team total. And the Mariners team total was over under 3.5 runs. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go hit 3.5 runs for just as hard as I can and just get in bets really quickly. And is what happened then. The Mariners, they got off to a pretty good start in the first inning. They did leave the inning with the bases loaded, though, but only scored 1 run and did nothing for the rest of the game until Domingo Germán randomly comes in relief and just immediately gives up a 3-run home run to Tom Murphy. So the entire reason I bet the team total was because Domingo Germán was not going to pitch. And the entire reason that the team total ended up hitting was because Domingo Germán ended up coming in to pitch. So there we go. It's sometimes better to be lucky than good. It was, I still think, a good bet that ended up having no reason to win, though.
Yeah, just like you drew it up.
Yeah, exactly. That was because which also, how does that even work? So Domingo Germán isn't going to pitch because he has a root canal, and then he just comes in a few innings later. I didn't really get what the deal was with that.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the anesthetic wore off and he felt okay.
Yeah, it was either way. It was a really weird situation. But guys, today's show is sponsored by PrizePicks. If you're new to PrizePicks, go check it out, prizepicks.com. Use the promo code AWESEMO on your first deposit. Get up to $100 match on the first deposit that you make. And PrizePicks, once again, just another different way to play daily fantasy sports. Instead of building lineups, competing with a field, you're building prop cards, and you could also combine props with all different kinds of sports, whether it be esports, baseball, basketball, football. That's going to be starting soon. Soccer. Combine all different sports together and make some fun parlays with different sports if you have knowledge across a wealth of different sports that are being played. But for today's slate, starting with the early slate, only 3 games here. And just, Adam, do you have any overarching thoughts on this slate? Only 3 games, and we have a combination of some okay pitchers and some really bad pitchers.
Just, I guess, a more general view of smaller slates in MLB. I think leaning on ownership, leaning on leverage against pitchers in particular, or against offenses, I think plays a bigger role than it does on bigger slates, just because you're getting more concentrated ownership, higher raw ownership numbers. So the benefit to just taking opposite stands to the field or taking stands that negatively correlate with the field, I think is a bit bigger on smaller slates.
Yeah, and this is a slate where, I mean, starting right off with the first game here, the Oakland A's taking on the Houston Astros. These are by far, to me at least, the top 2 pitchers on the slate to talk about, Frankie Montas and Lance McCullers. You know, Lance McCullers has been a little bit of a step back from where he was pre-injury, although still a quality starting pitcher. The biggest dip has been in his velocity. Lance McCullers' average fastball velocity is down about a mile per hour from what he was pre-surgery. But, you know, he still found some ways to have success this year, even if it doesn't mean that he's quite the same overall quality of pitcher that he was at his peak. But still, 2.97 ERA, 3.74 expected ERA. The strikeout rate, 26.5%, all fine. But tough matchup against the A's. So Lance McCullers, I guess the way to look at him is compared to Frankie Montas, who's the priority spend-up option at pitcher.
So I think McCullers is in the better spot. I mean, the A's have a sub-4 implied run total, whereas the Astros have an implied run total over 5. McCullers comes into the game striking out about 26.5% of hitters this year. The walk rate is alarming at 12.7%, but we know the strikeout upside's there. It's an okay spot against Oakland. Matt Chapman may or may not be in the lineup, which would weaken that offense a bit if he is out. So I think McCullers is the priority, but you also have to, in tournaments, keep in mind that right now we have McCullers projected for 52.5% ownership on DraftKings. Montas projected for just 12.5% ownership. So even though I think McCullers is the better pitcher, that does factor into play that you're getting 3.5 times the ownership going to McCullers.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy that Montas is
4.5.
that. It's pretty crazy that Montas is that much less ownership, and I certainly feel more comfortable in McCullers. But just looking at this as a 3-game slate, Montas is certainly a pitcher to get overweight to the field on. Like you said, only 12.6% projected ownership. You look at his odds being a top 2 pitcher, it's at 26.2%. Then you go over to FanDuel, where you have Montas projected for 10%. It's maybe a little bit more reasonable relative to the price there because we have Montas only at 7,500. So also on a single pitcher site, relatively that's, a little bit more popularity. But Frankie Montas, I think, is one of the best GPP plays for the early slate.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't really have a lot of confidence that he does well. I mean, it's a difficult matchup. Houston's a good offense, but it's when you're talking GPPs, a lot of times it's not about like to an extent, it's about the percentage of the time that he does well, but it really comes back to how well can he do when he pitches well. And Montas does have a 23.5% strikeout percentage, much higher strikeout rate against lefties than righties because he only throws his splitter to lefties pretty much, which is really frustrating. But the Astros should have three lefties in their top 6. They'll probably have a pretty balanced lineup top to bottom. So it's an okay spot for strikeouts for Montas. And again, it's just that he at least has the talent to compete, to keep up with McCullers on the days he pitches well. And as long as the ownership is low, like you said, his top 2 pitcher percentage is more than twice as high as his projected ownership right now.
Yeah, and then as far as stacking against Lance McCullers, for me personally, he's not somebody I'm usually dying to stack against. However, he's so popular for the early slate. And then also you look at our top stacks tool, the most positively leveraged stack on the slate is the Oakland A's. They're only picking up 8.8% projected ownership. They do have a 12.3% chance to be the top scoring team on DraftKings. And then for FanDuel purposes, we have them also going very underowned, only 8.5% projected ownership, 12.5% chance to be a top stack. So to me, I think it makes a whole lot of sense to get overweight to the field on A's stacks. And then it also makes sense to roster Frankie Montas with those stacks, particularly on FanDuel, something that I brought up when we were doing a show kind of similar to this. I think it might have even been for last Wednesday or last Thursday slate, where there was a Jose Barrios versus Carlos Rodon slate. And I said that, like, hey, it was something that ultimately didn't work out, but the same logic is going to apply here. When Jose Barrios was only picking up a fraction of the ownership pitching against Carlos Rodon, especially on FanDuel on a single pitcher site where the win bonus is pretty important, I think it makes a lot of sense to make A's stacks. You hope that they're able to get to Lance McCullers a little bit on FanDuel, and then you roster Frankie Montas with them because there's the added correlation with the win there. It's hard to find correlations like that pitcher offense in baseball, but this is a spot where I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with you. We were definitely doing the show together when you brought up that point with Barrios, and it was one that I hadn't really thought of, and I definitely don't hear people talk about. But it does make sense in that particular context to knowing that where the win is a little bit more important on FanDuel, and you necessarily can't have you don't have both pitchers. Using the pitchers to negatively correlate makes sense. And then just from a stacking perspective on DraftKings, it goes back to what I was saying at the top of the show. With it only being a 3-game slate, you're just getting so much raw ownership on Lance McCullers. It's not a pitcher that I like taking bats against, but he does have nearly a 13% walk percentage. He is someone that can get an elevated pitch count pretty early, put guys on base, and he just has a disappointing outing. The A's end up, getting more innings against the bullpen than against McCullers, which, still has its issues. But point being that he's going to fail often enough. He's not an infallible pitcher. He definitely has his flaws, and the A's do have a pretty decent lineup. So I do like getting to Oakland in tournaments just because of McCullers' ownership.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm going to point out too, the way that I play these small, like 3-4 game baseball slates, I don't even care almost about expected outcome. It's all about leveraging ownership. Like, there's no point where being like on a 12 game baseball slate, you could say, I think this pitcher is going to be the best pitcher on the slate. I have the most confidence in him. Therefore, this is the guy I want to roster the most. And, ownership tends to be spread a little bit thinner. But then you start to get to these, smaller baseball slates where all of a sudden you have pitchers, Jordan Montgomery projected for 60% ownership. Lance McCullers projected for 53% ownership. It's all about leveraging ownership because to me, while, McCullers is definitely the best pitcher on the slate, there's still a point where it's like, okay, but how likely is he to end up in the optimal lineup? And because everything has a break-even point. So, for this slate, we have Lance McCullers with a 45% chance of being a top 2 scoring pitcher on DraftKings, 53% projected ownership. So, ultimately, Lance McCullers does look a little bit over-owned. And on the other side, there's very little ownership going to Oakland just because everybody's going to McCullers. So, I approach these 3-game slates, wildly different than I do bigger slates.
Yeah, I agree with that. it just makes more sense because of the percentage of the field that you're knocking off if you do well. There's so much variance in baseball that when you get more concentrated ownership, it makes sense to kind of just do the opposite.
Yeah, and then on the other side for Houston as a potential stack, team that looks like it's going about appropriately owned on FanDuel. No significant negative or positive leverage in either direction. By the way, also, guys, the top stacks tool is free to use today. Personally, that is my favorite tool we have over on Awesemo.com for baseball. So I highly suggest going to check it out. And you can see the kind of data that Adam and I are looking at really helps me with building my lineups and trying to figure out exactly, what percentage of stacks I want to play, trying to figure out which teams are over or under owned. On DraftKings, though, Houston does look a little bit over leveraged, 20.6% projected ownership share, 18.5% chance of being a top stack. Going up against Frankie Montas, there are bad pitchers on the slate. Montas, I do think there's a chance he's going to be a little bit worse going forward now that there is no more sticky substance in play for the pitchers. But still, Frankie Montas is going woefully under-owned for DFS purposes. So for me, I'd rather get more exposure to Frankie Montas than the Houston Astros bats.
Yeah, same answer for me. And again, it's not that I'm super confident in Montas. It's just that the Astros bats don't appear to offer much leverage. They're projected to be owned about where they should be, whereas Montas is one of the most under-owned pitchers in terms of his ownership versus his chances of success. So I'm more inclined to go to Montas and away from the Houston bats.
All right, the next game on the slate, and some of the more interesting DFS GPP spots we get for baseball. We have two awful offenses and two terrible pitchers on the mound. The Colorado Rockies against the Arizona Diamondbacks. It is two stoppable forces, two movable objects. Chichi Gonzalez against Jacob Faria, and the two teams that are last and second to last in all of baseball in WRC plus against right-handed pitching. So I'll start with this. In terms of the pitchers, if you had to roster one or say be heavier on one in tournaments, which one would you prefer to go to?
So normally my answer would be Faria because, for one, the Rockies suck, and I don't think Jake Faria is that bad. I think he's a better pitcher than Chichi Gonzalez. But we've only seen him go 4 innings each of his last 2 starts. I'm not confident that he's going further than that here, whereas Chichi Gonzalez is fully stretched out. So I think his ceiling is probably a little bit higher, just talking in terms of when he pitches well, how many fantasy points can he score? I think is probably a little bit higher. And then you also have Arizona getting the most ownership on the slate right now. So you get a little bit bigger edge taking a pitcher against them than you do Colorado. So I don't feel very strongly one way or the other, but I think Chichi Gonzalez actually makes a little bit more sense from a game theory standpoint.
Yeah, and then one thing I'm going to just address. So Blitz, she asked us in the YouTube channel, is the Houston game going to get rained out? They have a retractable roof, so if it starts raining, they just put the roof up there. So never anything to really be concerned about. But getting back to the Colorado and Arizona game here, yeah, I agree with you. Once again, it's just really an ownership thing. And then also Chichi Gonzalez, as bad as he is, number one, he's actually been slightly better than this in previous years. I mean, he only has a 12.9% strikeout rate. That's impossibly low. If you look at his K rate, at least from the last 2 years, 17.6%, 16.5%. Also not anything to get super excited about. However, there's reason to think there's more strikeouts coming for him in the future. And then also just the price point where Chichi Gonzalez at 5,600 on DraftKings for FanDuel purposes, single pitcher site. I don't think there's any reason to go to Chichi Gonzalez, but on DK, if we're looking for a cheap SP2, I do think that Gonzalez offers a little bit of leverage to the point where he's only projected for 4% ownership right now. In the build I made this morning, I had 8% Chichi Gonzalez, so slightly more in the field. Not a high priority play, but given the context of a 3-game slate, I'm good with getting overweight to the field on him.
Yeah, as long as overweight means more than 4%, I think that's fine.
Yeah, it's not a thing where I'm looking at Chichi Gonzalez being like, hey, he's going to be in 40% of my lineups. It's just I have him in sub 10%, but that's still more than what the field has. As for the offenses here, we do have Arizona as a team that looks like they're going, way over-owned here. 26% ownership share for Arizona. This is very similar to how I felt about Arizona and Colorado last night, where it's like, hey, it's a good hitting environment. The matchups are good, but it's really hard for me to ever say that Arizona warrants picking up a whole bunch of ownership. Yesterday, they were the 3rd most popular stack heading into this slate. The Rockies, they were the 5th most popular stack or something like that. And ultimately, these are the 2 worst teams in baseball in terms of WRC plus against right-hand pitching. So, the Rockies, they do look about appropriately owned, but Arizona, I think, is a team to come pretty heavily underweight to today.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it just goes back to they're getting a lot of ownership and neither team is very good. Yeah, like I get why they're getting ownership. Both pitchers, well, Chichi Gonzalez isn't very good. Jake Faria is kind of whatever, but I understand why the ownership is there. The Diamondbacks are really, really cheap. They have an implied run total just north of 5, so they're going to be really easy to get into lineups. But at the same time, they're just not a very good offense. They're going to fail against pretty much anybody pretty frequently, just based on the talent level in this lineup. And then you can say the same thing for Colorado. To me, looking at the top stack tool and then also looking at the ownership going to pitchers, I would just so much rather, when you talk about, Arizona and Colorado and the lack of power really in their lineups, and then the lack of ownership going to the pitchers against them, I would just rather be taking a lot of this Arizona and Colorado ownership and moving it to the Athletics and moving it to the Mariners.
Yeah, that's where I'm going to be at too. And also, we do have a super chat here from 8 Game. He's saying, I have made multiple lineups leaving $1,000 on the table for the early DK slate. Is that too much? No, not at all. Especially for the early slates. If you're going to stack some of these cheaper offenses, like the Mariners, for instance, who I do think make a lot of sense to stack, you're going to be leaving salary on the table. There isn't a stud pitcher. There's no Jacob deGrom. There's no Max Scherzer on the early slate. And, that's just going to mean if you're paying for a cheap offense, there's a good chance you're leaving salary on the table. I would assume, I don't know how I would sort this here, but anyway, of the lineups I have built on DraftKings right now, of the 150, I would assume that a good chunk of them, maybe even like 20 to 25%, have $1,000 or more left in salary, because that happens all the time on smaller slates. I have no issue with leaving salary on the table whatsoever for baseball, but especially smaller slates.
Yeah, I typically don't really do it much on bigger slates, just because you can normally find them upgrade. But on smaller slates, I think it's fine. And like, for example, if you just go to DraftKings and you click in Lance McCullers and Frankie Montas because they're the 2 most expensive pitchers, that leaves you $3,912 per position. If you look at the Arizona Diamondbacks lineup, because we, using them because they're cheap and we have them with the highest top stack percentage, there is one player in their projected lineup that is more expensive than that $3,900 average salary. So, you stack Arizona, you're getting even more room. It's just, you're going to leave money on the slate in a lot of lineups, I think.
Yeah, and I just went in Fantasy Cruncher, sorted my lineups by salary left over, and yeah, I have a couple of lineups here that have more than $2,000 on left on the table, and it's, once again, if you're stacking cheaper teams, especially on smaller slates, that's just going to happen. And I mean, that's a really easy way to differentiate too. There's no reason to think that the Seattle Mariners can't be the highest scoring team on this slate. It's not the most likely scenario, but still, we have it happening about 10% of the time. And also, I think that a lot of people are going to be stacking the Mariners. They might be making like 4-man stacks of the Mariners to be like, oh no, I'm leaving too much salary on the table. So yeah, for me, I like leaving salary on the table for these smaller slates, because I think if you don't do it, you're just not going to get to the lower owned offenses because they are cheap and a lot of people don't like to leave salary on the table. So yeah, no issue with that whatsoever. 8 Game, and depending what teams you stack, it probably makes more sense than not anyway. Last game that we have on the slate here, it is the New York Yankees against the Seattle Mariners. So one of the reasons that the Mariners are picking up so low ownership, well, number one, the Mariners don't have a great offense, but the other thing also, Jordan Montgomery is the most popular pitcher on the slate. So right now, projected ownership for Jordan Montgomery coming in at right around 60% on DraftKings. So he is going to be super popular. Makes sense given what his price point is, but still, I think it's a little bit too much ownership going towards him. On FanDuel, 33% owned. That one doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because to me, Jordan Montgomery versus Lance McCullers, salary is never too restricted on FanDuel. I don't think it makes sense that Jordan Montgomery should be 33% owned on FanDuel when Lance McCullers is 25% owned. So, Adam, what do you make of the difference in ownership between Montgomery and McCullers?
Yeah, on FanDuel, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me either. I mean, it's a perfectly fine matchup for Montgomery. He's a good enough pitcher. I don't really have any issues there. But assuming that $1,400 doesn't really matter on this slate, I still think that McCullers looks a little bit better, especially if he's going to be lower owned than Montgomery. So I agree with you there. And then on DraftKings, I think Montgomery is in cash. He's the SP2, I think. 8K is a perfectly fine price tag. The Mariners offense isn't anything special. Montgomery strikes out 22.5% of righties this year, 28% of lefties. He's given up some expected power to righties, only a 151 actual ISO, but a 201 expected ISO. But against lefties, he's been very, very good, hasn't given up power. In addition to striking out 28%, he's just a pretty solid pitcher, has good stuff. And, again, the Mariners offense isn't particularly scary. The ballpark isn't great for hitting either, and it looks like it's supposed to be around 70 degrees. So there's a lot working in Jordan Montgomery's favor here on a slate where pitching is pretty questionable. So I understand why he's getting the ownership. I think that at least in cash games, see the SP2.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And then on the other side, Logan Gilbert pitching for the Mariners going up against the Yankees offense. A lot of power in the Yankees offense. We saw a little bit of that early against Yusei Kikuchi yesterday, and then the Yankees did, I think, nothing after like the second inning or something like that. They scored all the runs in the first 2 or 3 innings, but there is still power in the Yankees lineup, although overall they've been really inconsistent this year. It's been a team that's, let down a decent amount, but Logan Gilbert, do you see him as a viable pitching option, at least relative to ownership on the slate?
I see him as a viable pitching option, but I don't really like the idea of taking a 47.5% owned pitcher here against the Yankees all that often. Like looking at the ownership, we have the Yankees with the second highest top stack percentage on the slate and coming in slightly under owned, but coming in a lot less owned than Arizona is, just ahead of them. Whereas when you look at the pitchers, Logan Gilbert, a 38% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, getting about 47.5% ownership. So I think both sides are in play, but I think there's a little bit more leverage going to the Yankee side of this. Gilbert, is a top pitching prospect for the Mariners and in baseball. Fangraphs has him as the Mariners number 3 prospect, number 35 overall. He, so far in the majors, has made 9 starts, gone 41 2/3 innings. He's struck out 26.2% of hitters. He's only walked 5.8. He's been pretty solid so far, in the majors. So I think he's a perfectly fine play. And again, he's right-handed. He's going to have the platoon advantage against the majority of the Yankees lineup. To me, it just comes down to ownership though, where you're getting, I think, a little bit more leverage going with the Yankees power than you are going with Gilbert.
Yeah, it is a lot of ownership going to Gilbert, and I'm going to be kind of interested to refresh this later in the day. I tend to think as we get closer to lock, Gilbert's ownership is going to go down and the Yankees ownership is going to go up, but still remains to be seen. It's a slate, even though it's an early slate, it locks at 2 p.m. Eastern. So still a few hours to go. So there's going to be updates there. Also, guys, don't forget the top stacks tool is free today. So go over to awesemo.com, check that out, give it a refresh later towards lock, and you can see a little bit better what some of the expected ownerships are for the offenses. And then overall, if you want access to all of the tools that we have over at awesemo.com, you get an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. And if you sign up right now and you're new to our product, use the promo code MLB Strategy Show. That's all capital letters, no spaces, all one word, MLB Strategy Show. That'll get you 25% off your first week of Awesemo Plus Platinum. And if you're only looking to try out our baseball package and you just want access to all our baseball tools, then you get an MLB weekly package for $15.95. Stop guessing, start winning. Join Awesemo Plus today. So, all right, that's going to do it for the early slate. We'll move into the main. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention one more thing. We talked about leaving salary on the table on the short slates. Mm-hmm. I'm also perfectly fine with just taking like a hitter against a pitcher, especially if it's a power hitter. I think that's one of the easiest ways to differentiate because people just like automatically don't do that out of like habit. But it really pops up when we talk about that Logan Gilbert Yankees matchup because Gilbert has good strikeout numbers. He's been a good pitcher, but he has given up power to right-handed bats with a 229 ISO allowed, 225 expected ISO. I think one of the easiest ways to differentiate here, like even if you have Gilbert, throw in Aaron Judge, throw in Gary Sanchez, throw in Stanton, someone like that is relatively likely to hit a home run. And Gilbert is, as long as it's not a grand slam or something, Gilbert's cheap enough that he can still have a good start from a fantasy standpoint, even though he allows, a home run or two.
Yeah. Also, that's something I do as well. Is there a certain number of games for you that you enable or disable hitters versus pitchers in Fantasy Cruncher? I know for me, anything 4 games or less, I'm willing to do 1 hitter versus pitcher. And then depending on the slate, every once in a while, I'll allow 2. Right now, I have Fantasy Cruncher set to 1. And then anything 5 or more games, I feel like there's enough options where I don't need to do that. But do you have any sort of parameters like that you usually use?
Those are like the exact ones I use. It's not even based on anything outside of intuition. It just kind of feels right. I think that you could, and if you wanted to take more time on it, you could certainly make a case. I think like on those 5 or 6 game slates and go through and say like no hitters against my pitcher, except for spots like the Yankees against Gilbert, where he gives up power. I think that, I guess optimally you probably do just kind of go through and pick the spots where you wouldn't mind having a hitter against your pitcher. But I typically don't actually do that. And I use the same parameters as you do.
Yeah. And once again, it's not something I've really delved into, super deep. It's just the thing, like where you said, it just kind of feels right. And then the other thing also, for a 3-game baseball slate, it becomes really restrictive if you don't allow hitters versus pitchers. And I think you really limit the amount of options you have. So yeah. And the other thing also with a 3-game slate, if any individual player hits a home run, there's a pretty good chance on a 3-game slate, they're going to land in the optimal lineup. So right. 1 hitter versus pitcher is certainly something that I like to do for for a 3-game slate. Not to say that you have to have a hitter versus one of your pitchers in every lineup, but in general, it's something that if you build multiple lineups, I don't have an issue with having that in some of them. But moving over to the main slate now, and right away, this is just a massive headache. Can the rain just stop? Do we have to deal with this every night? But the Toronto Blue Jays going up against Adams Baltimore Orioles, who, by the way, as long as I'm upset with the Baltimore Orioles, they're going to be Adams Baltimore Orioles. Alek Manoah, who I feel like starts against the Orioles once a week at this point. Keegan Aiken on the mound for Baltimore. Another spot where the Toronto Blue Jays are super chalk. They're expected to score 1 million runs. But the issue here is the weather. So in Baltimore today, we're expecting later on in the day, 80% chance of rain. It just becomes a question of when is the rain going to start? When is it going to be during the game? Because, right now it is expected to be right towards the middle of the game, but is it ultimately going to be to a point where it's going to rain at the start of the game and they're not going to be able to play? Because once it starts raining, at least per the weather report right now, it looks like it's not going to stop. It's going to go all through the day. All through the night past midnight. It's just a thing where we have 7.5 hours now until lock. It's something we need a little bit more info on in terms of the weather. It's something to keep an eye on. So for now, do you have any initial thoughts on the weather? And then what are you doing with this super chalky Blue Jay stack?
Yeah, right now it just looks like a mess. Like even reading the forecast from our competitor weatherman on a different site, like he even says that it looks like the rain could just miss like a couple miles east of the stadium, which would mean that it pours where I live and the Orioles still get to play baseball. But yeah, it just seems like something that you're gonna have to pay attention to later in the day. I guess general thoughts, because talking about the bats, my general thoughts are when there's uncertainty or with rain and it drives down ownership, I like going to the bats. I'm a lot quicker to jump off pitching, but it's just a situation that hopefully we get a lot more information as lock approaches.
Yeah, and then the other thing too, by the way, guys, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our video today, because there is going to be an MLB Live before lock later. There's going to be MLB Deeper Dive coming up. Thankfully, I am not going to have to be on it playing Weatherman, because I'm doing NBA Live before lock with Lofty tonight. So I'll get a little reprieve. I'll let somebody else guess on the weather tonight, but it's definitely something we're going to have to keep an eye on. It's going to play a massive role on this slate. But if you look at the Toronto Blue Jays, which, it's crazy, even with them coming in as super chalk, and I say, in general, when there's a team that's picking up a massive amount of ownership on a substantially sized baseball slate, like 75 to 80% of the time, just throwing out a number, they're probably going to be overowned. Tonight, though, we have the Blue Jays with a 26% ownership share and a 26.2% chance of being the top stack. So at least per our current numbers, as crazy as the ownership is for a 7-game slate, they don't even look overowned.
Yeah, it's the same exact situation we had yesterday where they aren't projected to be overowned, but the raw ownership numbers are still just going to be massive, where the larger the tournament is, the more inclined I would be to start kind of moving away from them. Basically what I ended up getting a lot of yesterday, because I still ended up around the field in terms of exposure to the Blue Jays bats, but mostly, I had some 5-man Blue Jay stacks, but mostly I was stacking lower owned teams like the Dodgers, like the Nats, like, whoever that, these 5% or lower owned teams. And I also was on a couple of lower owned pitchers. And then I was just rounding it out with the best plays, which happened to be, Guerrero, Springer, guys like that. So that's where my exposure was mostly going in those large field tournaments. I'm still playing those guys because I think they're really, really good. But it was on teams where, if the stack goes off, I'm competing with a small enough percentage of the field that I'm more willing to have a couple of Blue Jays bats in there, as opposed to mostly, saying, oh, well, I'm going to use 5 of my lineup spots to play 25% owned guys. And then if those guys go off, I'm still competing with 25% of the field. So you can still play them, but I think you need to be aware of like getting very low owned hitters around them.
And do you see any way to maybe differentiate some of the Blue Jay stack? Because I know, like for me last night, I looked at Toronto, and the only player that stood out as being lower owned was Lourdes Gurriel yesterday. He was only projected for, I think it was like 7 or 8% ownership off the top of my head. I don't remember the exact number, but every single player in that lineup was projected for north of 20% ownership today, with Gurriel being the only guy that came in with lower ownership. So is there anybody like that stands out to you today, maybe even Gurriel again, do you be willing to get to be like, hey, this is a slightly different Blue Jay stack?
No, it's more the same today. We have Santiago Espinal projected to be in the lineup and be 2% owned. But outside of that, Gurriel, 13%, is the lowest owned lowest owned guy in the Toronto lineup. So that's another thing that makes it difficult is a lot of times when you get a team with high aggregate ownership, it's a couple of guys are really good values and they're driving up the team ownership. That's not the case with Toronto. It's just top to bottom, good hitters, good power, guys that project well, guys that are going to be popular.
All right. And then starting for Toronto, I don't understand why number one, Manoah continues to be this cheap. And then number two, why he just never really picks up ownership. So Manoah only 6,800. And obviously we're going to have to keep an eye on the weather because that could change things. But Alek Manoah at 6,800 on DraftKings is a potential SP2 option, only picking up 14% projected ownership. You look at his numbers for the year, and he's been really solid, 2.7 ERA, 3.43 expected ERA. But most importantly, from a DFS standpoint, 29.1% K rate. You look at his minor league numbers, 40.9% K rate in AAA this year. Last numbers we had on him in minor leagues before this, he had a 39.7% strikeout rate in A-ball. So everything looks like Alek Manoah. He is the type of guy who, when he has good outings for fantasy purpose, for real life purposes, is going to be good for fantasy because of the strikeout upside. So to me, I think he's a very high priority play as long as the weather cooperates.
Yep, I agree. I don't really understand why he's only $6,800 on DraftKings. The strikeout stuff's good. Through 109 pitches last start, that's the most that we've gotten from him. So yeah, there's, to me, I mean, I mentioned a lot that I think the Orioles offense is a little bit more dangerous than people probably give them credit for, but you're getting a really cheap price tag on a pitcher that has very good strikeout stuff. 30.7% strikeout percentage against righties this year, 27.4 against lefties. He's done a reasonable job of limiting power as well. So I think as long as the weather cooperates, Manoah looks very, very good.
Yeah, and the reason that I felt like Alek Manoah makes a lot of starts against the Orioles. This is the third time in his last four starts he's gone up against Baltimore. So lucky for him, he gets to face this terrible Orioles team about once a week at this rate. So yeah, Alek Manoah, that's my favorite SP2 option today on DraftKings. On the other side of the game, though, any interest in stacking against Manoah with the Orioles?
I don't really love full stacking against him here because I think that he does have the platoon advantage against Mountcastle, Hayes, Mancini, and then you also have the positional issue with Mancini and Mountcastle playing the same position on DraftKings. He's also right now somehow Manoah's only projected for 14% ownership. If that stays there, like it's not even enough ownership that I'm really looking to go against him. I will point out Cedric Mullins though, only 3,400 leading off, obviously having a fantastic season for the Orioles. I think even if you expect him to regress somewhat, which I do, I still think he's a good hitter. I think he's a good player, and 3,400 is pretty cheap.
All right, the next game here, the Kansas City Royals taking on the Cleveland Indians. Danny Duffy against Zach Plesac. Now, I've been looking for information on Duffy to try to figure out what's going on with his pitch count because he's a guy who I thought we were going to really start to see get ramped up in terms of pitches last time out. So he came off the injured list, was on a pitch count. First start he made was 42 pitches against the Yankees. That wasn't a massive surprise. Then he made, a starter one, which I think you had pointed out to me at the time. That was really more of just like a throw day for him, just threw 15 pitches and, that was whatever. But then the next start after that against Boston, he throws 62 pitches. And I'm thinking like, okay, 45 pitches, 62. Danny Duffy, now viable GPP play. We're going to start to see his pitch count ramped up. And then they got to 69 pitches last time. And, he's still really cheap on DraftKings. I would like to get Duffy at 7,400. The issue is just that I don't know how deep he's going to go into the game. Only 3% projected ownership. So I think he's worth being overweight to the field on. But if I end up finding out some B reporter somewhere, they're like, hey, Danny Duffy's going to throw 80 to 90 pitches today. Duffy's going to be one of my favorite overall GPP plays on the slate. So what kind of expectation do you have for how deep he's going to go into the game?
Yeah, I think it's pretty tough to get a read on it now because I was in the same boat as you. Normally when you see someone throw like 62 pitches, then they're going to throw 75 to 80, and then they're usually good to go by their third start after that. But only getting to about 70 pitches last game is concerning. Maybe he goes an extra inning and gets like 75 to 80 here, which is still okay at 7,400, but obviously you would like a lot more. So, I mean, I think that it's unlikely he just is unleashed and gives you a full start here, which does temper my interest. But in larger field tournaments, he is only 7,400. He does have very good strikeout stuff. There is uncertainty here, which is always something that I like when you're talking about low-owned players that have the talent that Duffy does. So you can certainly make a case for him. But again, I just wouldn't want, unless we get more information that says he's good to go, I wouldn't want a large percentage of my lineups hinging on Duffy because I think there's a good chance you're getting 5 innings.
Yeah, and then I also think it's hard to know what to do with the Indians as a stack just because we don't know how deep Duffy's going to the game. Like, I think Danny Duffy's a really solid starting pitcher if he's going to be full go. I don't have all that much interest in stacking the Indians, but if it's going to be a situation where he's going to throw 3 or 4 innings, then a little bit more interest there. Right now, we do have the Indians as a positively leveraged stack, but do you have any strong feelings on them without knowing for sure what's going on with Duffy?
No, I think it's a pretty mediocre spot just because Duffy is good, but I do like the prices on the Indians. Franmil Reyes, his salary is rising, but he's still only 4K. That's a guy with massive power. Harold Ramirez most likely batting fifth, only 3,400. Rosario batting second, probably batting second is 4,500 on DraftKings. Cesar Hernandez 3,900. Even 5,200 for Jose Ramirez isn't a bad price for how good he is. So I think Cleveland's in a decent spot here. And again, like you said, we do have them projected to be positively leveraged, fourth highest top stack percentage on the slate at 8.2%, 6.8% projected ownership share. So the way it looks right now, I like Cleveland in tournaments, but again, I think it's just a pretty big wild card on both sides here because so much hinges on how deep Duffy can go into this game.
And then we kind of have a similar situation on the other side. Zach Plesac coming off of the injured list is going to be starting for the Indians today. Plesac was dealing with a thumb injury. He's expected to throw around 60 pitches today. Given that he's priced up on FanDuel and DraftKings, 60 pitches, no reason to roster Zach Plesac. But at the same time, he's a quality enough starting pitcher that I don't really have interest in the Royals either. So, 7-game slate when I'm looking for spots to take out of my player pool, looks like Plesac and the Royals are both going to be those kind of spots for me.
Yeah, agreed. It's not like you're getting any sort of discount on Plesac. Kansas City isn't a great offense that I like to target anyway, and now you're assuming they're going to get 4 or 5 innings against a decent pitcher in Plesac. They're projected to basically get the ownership that they deserve as well. So nothing really standing out there, unless I do think you can take one-offs. Jorge Soler 2,900, Ryan O'Hearn 2,900, Hunter Dozier 2,600, Benintendi 3,100. I think those guys are just a little bit underpriced for the upside that they give you at the plate.
Yeah, that's reasonable enough. I mean, they do project as, a fairly good chance of being a top value stock on the slate, but in general, Plesac, not really a guy that I'm really dying to stack against. And then the Indians, they do have a pretty good bullpen behind them. So to me, not a spot where I'm going to be super high on the Royals. Next game, the Pittsburgh Pirates against the New York Mets. Pirates going up against Taijuan Walker. Not a spot that I'm going to want to stack, but JT Brubaker is somebody who I have had interest in at times on slates this year. The problem I have with Brubaker tonight, even though 6,500 price tag is pretty good, is there are other pitchers today, Tyreek Skubal, Alek Manoah. We just mentioned Danny Duffy. If he doesn't have a pitch limit, that I prefer to Brubaker. So just for that reason, he's cheap, but there's other SP2 options I prefer. So that's why I don't think I'm going to ultimately have Brubaker really in my player pool.
Yeah, I mean, the price tag is okay. The matchup is decent. Brubaker himself is kind of just like a mediocre arm as well. Comes in with a 23% strikeout percentage, 3.85 xFIP. He's just a decent arm here, but hard to have a lot of confidence in him. He's gone 6 innings in 3 straight starts, which is nice to see. Threw 93 pitches last time out as well, which is good to see. So I have some interest in Brubaker, but again, not somebody that I'm overly confident in.
Yeah, and then on the other side, the Mets, they just look like about a neutral stack. We have them with 5.5% chance to be a top stack, 4.1% ownership share. So to me, whatever, if you have some exposure to the Mets in your player pool, no problem with that. But I'm not going on my way to stack the Mets. I think that Brubaker is still a quality starting pitcher. Yeah,
I actually think Pete Alonso at 5K looks pretty good. Brubaker's given up more power to righties than lefties this year. 249 actual ISO, 230 expected ISO to right-handed hitters compared to a 152 expected ISO to lefties. So you can certainly look to some of the left-handed bats that are good on the Mets. But based on what we've seen from Brubaker this year, I actually think Peter Alonso is the guy that really stands out.
And then starting for the Mets, Taijuan Walker. Once again, I think he is a pretty quality starting pitcher. You look at his numbers for the year, 2.44 ERA, 3.66 expected ERA. The strikeout numbers this year way up over what we've seen over the course of his career, 25.9% strikeout rate for Taijuan Walker. However, for me, similar to JT Brubaker, there are other pitchers I prefer to spend up for. We have Tyler Mahle on the slate, Max Scherzer, Yu Darvish. There's a lot of expensive pitching options that look like they're in pretty good spots. And Taijuan Walker, it is a really favorable matchup for him against the Pittsburgh Pirates, but he's also really popular. To me, 25% owned Taijuan Walker. Unless his ownership comes down, I'm going to be underweight to the field on him.
Yeah, I think I agree with that as well. I like the spot for him. I think that he's good. The issue I run into is that he is getting ownership here. He's in the middle of the pack in terms of top 2 pitcher percentage. And like you said, Tyler Mahle only $300 more expensive than he is. So that's tough. We already talked about liking Manoah, who is a lot less expensive. there's just kind of other arms I like a little bit more here.
Yeah, that's really where I'm at. Taijuan Walker, it's, the 8,400 price tag, even that I would look at and be like, I guess he's safe for cash games. But there's other guys I'd rather roster for cash games. Like Alek Manoah is $1,600 cheaper if I need to go down to a cheap SP2. And then if you're paying up for somebody, once again, Tyler Mahle, Max Scherzer, Yu Darvish, there's a lot of other guys to choose from. So Taijuan Walker, it's hard to find a spot where he would really become a high priority play, but there's no way I'm stacking the Pirates against him either.
Yeah, the same boat. The Pirates just kind of suck. Walker's getting 24% ownership, which you could make a case, to leverage stack, but I don't think that's quite enough ownership for me to want to go to a Pirates team that has a 3.2 implied run total. I think that, there's other spots that look a little bit better. I do think maybe it's a little bit more viable. Like if the Toronto game were to get rained out, I think that you'll see a little bit more ownership going to Walker because Manoah comes off the board, and then you're also taking the top stack off the slate. Then I think maybe the Pirates start to creep into play for me, but the way it looks right now, it's pretty difficult to get there. The lowest top stack percentage on the slate for Pittsburgh.
Yeah, the Pirates, there's been a couple of spots where I've gone to them. I think the one I remember most notably was there's a spot where like Kyle Hendricks was like projected for 40% ownership against the Pirates. And that's a spot where like, hey, if there's just a massive chalk pitcher going up against Pittsburgh, I'm willing to go there. But, other than that, in general, the Pirates just don't have a good offense, and it's hard to really see the upside in playing them. Next game we have here, the Philadelphia Phillies at the Chicago Cubs. Similar to yesterday, we have a lot of wind blowing in at Wrigley Field. Looks like about 12 miles per hour wind. So that is going to be favorable for the pitchers, at least in theory, favorable for the pitchers. It didn't work out all that well for Zach Wheeler last night, but I'm hoping that today maybe it goes a little bit better for the pitchers. At the very least, I don't really want to stack the offenses a whole bunch in this spot with the wind blowing in. The Chicago Cubs, because of the wind situation, we only have them with a 3% chance to be the top stack on the slate. The Philadelphia Phillies, we only have with a 4.5% chance being a top stack. So Zach Eflin, Adbert Alzolay, they aren't my favorite pitchers for the slate, but the offense is also, I don't think this is an environment that's great for scoring.
Yeah, it doesn't look like great hitting conditions. Both of these pitchers are reasonably good as well. Zach Eflin's done a good job of limiting power this year. 157 expected ISO to righties, 169 to lefties. Adbert Alzolay, 149 to righties, 315 to lefties. So he has given up some power to left-handed bats, but pretty good strikeout stuff as well. I think if you're going to bats here, you are looking at left-handed power from the Phillies, which essentially leaves you with Bryce Harper.
Yeah, and I mean, Bryce Harper's a one-off is never a bad thing, but still, I'm going to be fairly low on the offense in this game just because of the wind conditions, unless that changes. Wind blowing in at Wrigley Field, not something I generally like to get to a whole time. Then you look at the Phillies offense per our top stacks tool, which is free today. 6.6% projected ownership, only 4.5% chance to be a top stack. So at least in the initial builds that I made, just based on the hitting conditions and that there is some ownership going here, I made 0% stacks of both the Phillies and the Cubs. So that's where I'm at right now. But tell me about the pitchers here. Are either the pitchers guys that you would like to get to here?
I have some interest. About 15% ownership going to Zach Eflin at 7,500. I think with the favorable pitching conditions, he's certainly viable at that price point. Decent strikeout stuff. Pretty good at limiting hard contact and limiting power. Comes into the game with a 22% strikeout percentage, only a 3% walk percentage. So you can expect him to be pretty efficient with his pitches. 3.64 xFIP. Definitely better at preventing runs than getting strikeouts, which isn't really the type of pitcher that I love going to in DFS, but I do think he's cheap enough that he's worth a look. Alzolay has better strikeout stuff, decent spot against the Phillies. My concern on him is that he typically doesn't go too deep in the games as far as pitch counts go. Like last start, he went 7 innings, but he still only threw 82 pitches. Prior to that, you got 67, 69, 82, 83. It's pretty tough to expect more than like 80 to 85 pitches from Alzolay, which does, that inning that he's losing does, cap the upside a little bit.
Yeah, and then the other thing too about this, like there's just so many good starting pitchers to go to that, it makes it hard to really seriously consider some of these mid-tier guys. And then there are also some cheaper pitching options that I do like today. One of them is in the next game, the Detroit Tigers against the Minnesota Twins. It isn't Jay Happ that I like, but Tarik Skubal, he's shown strikeout upside this year. He's not a great real life pitcher, so there's a little bit of inconsistency there, but still, you look at the strikeout numbers for him for the year. He has a 27.6% K rate, which, by the way, is identical to what he had last year, 27.6% K rate then also. So it does seem like there's pretty substantial strikeout upside in Skubal. His results this year have not been particularly great. 4.35 ERA, 5.29 expected ERA. The matchup is tough against the Twins, But just considering his price point, the low ownership here on Scooball, only projected for 3% ownership, as an SP2 option on DraftKings, I like him just because of the strikeout potential.
I think in large field tournaments that makes sense, because this to me looks like a very big boomer bust spot just based on what we've seen for him. He comes into this game with a 28.3% strikeout percentage against right-handed hitters specifically. The Twins lineup will most likely be very right-handed heavy against him. So the strikeout stuff, it looks really good. The issue is that he's also allowed a 238 ISO, 232 expected ISO to righties. And you also have some right-handed power in this lineup, especially if Josh Donaldson's back for Minnesota. So it has the potential to be like, if Scooball's on top of his game, he can carve this lineup up and give you a really good start. If he's not on top of his game, this is a lineup that can make you pay pretty quickly. So I think it's a really big boomer bust spot. In smaller field stuff, I would probably not get to him. But in large field stuff, especially if he's going to be like 3% owned or so, I think it does make sense just from the strikeout standpoint. Like when you look at, for example, Zach Eflin's at 7,500 with 15% ownership, Tarek Scooball, 3% ownership at 7,200. I think Zach Eflin is going to outscore Scooball more than 50% of the time. But I think when Scooball has his best games, it's probably a little bit higher score than Eflin's because of the strikeout upside.
Yeah, and also something else to consider here. And this is also, there's a lot of what ifs here. So it's just kind of making some assumptions. But if the Toronto-Baltimore game ends up not playing, I think the Twins are just going to end up being massively popular. So right now we have the Twins projected for the third most ownership. Blue Jays being 1, Baltimore being 2, Minnesota 3. Minnesota could be a team that winds up with like 20-ish% projected ownership if that game doesn't ultimately end up playing. And if that's the case, then I would really like Scuba also as a leverage pitcher. Obviously, that's a lot of one-if scenarios, but over 7 hours to go until lock, just throwing that out as a possibility.
To follow up on that, if that game gets rained out, you're also losing Alek Manoah, so you don't have that cheap pitcher to go to.
Yeah, so that's another scenario where, Scooball's somebody I've rostered a whole bunch over the last month or so. Mixed results for sure on Scooball because he's not a good pitcher, but he's a guy who has a pretty favorable fantasy outlook when he is going well just because of the strikeout upside. But yeah, as of now, I do like to stack the Twins against him also just because it is such a highly volatile spot. I have a feeling that either Scooball or the Twins, one of those sides is going to have a pretty good GPP day. But starting for Minnesota, we do have J Happ. He has also been very miserable this year. He does not generally have much fantasy upside, but at the same time too, the Detroit Tigers, miserable offense. They've been awful against left-handed pitching in particular this year. So what do you make of Happ going up against the Detroit offense?
Might be the only time this year I think the Tigers are the best, are like in a better spot than the pitcher facing them. J Happ's just been absolute garbage against right-handed hitters this year. 17.5% strikeout percentage, 288 ISO allowed, 264 expected ISO. So it's not even like he's getting that unlucky. And the Tigers are most likely going to have a right-handed heavy lineup. Granted, they're not the best right-handed hitters, but you're probably going to have 9 of them. And some of them, do have some power. Jonathan Scope is expensive, but he's got power from the right side. Eric Haas has power from the right side. That's about the extent, I think, of the right-handed power. But you still also have, right-handed hitters. Candelario is inexpensive. Cabrera is inexpensive. Like, it's just a team that you can stack for cheap in a good spot. You can pay up for 1 or 2 pitchers, or pay up for 1 pitcher and get really good one-offs around them. The Tigers are getting ownership, which is always scary. It's kind of in that same category of like Arizona and Colorado, where it's like I hate rostering popular teams that suck. But J.A. Happ's really bad, and I do like the prices on the Tigers here.
Yeah, Happ's numbers this year, he's a 6.09 ERA, 5.39 expected ERA. I think he's had a couple of not as bad games lately, but still, so he had a start against Cleveland where he pitched 6 innings, gave up 2 runs. He had a start against Cincinnati, 4 2/3 and 3 runs. Those are like arguably his 2 best starts of the year. His other starts is in here. Last time out against the Royals, 4 innings, 6 runs against Seattle. By the way, he hasn't even had a difficult strength of schedule. I'm looking through his box score. Like, he's had a lot of easy starts, and he just generally gets torched by bad offenses. So, yeah, I think J Happ, fine pitcher to pick on here. I really like to roster the Tigers, particularly against left-handed pitching. But right here, we just have such a bad pitcher on the mound that I'm going to side with Detroit. It's pretty crazy to see that, as bad as Detroit has been against lefties this year, we have them with the 3rd best odds being the top stack on the slate. And just given how bad Happ has been this year, I can't disagree with it. They also have a 17.3% chance of being the top value stack on the slate. So something else that's pretty favorable about that is, if you want to pay up for a couple of the stud pitchers, Darvish, Max Scherzer, you do that pretty easily with twin stacks. And another pitcher we're going to have to consider here, and this is somebody I'm really struggling with, Tyler Mahle, who we do project really well on our site going up against Milwaukee Brewers. The Brewers are a team that strikes out a whole bunch against right-handed pitching. The problem, though, with Tyler Mahle is that ever since we have seen the crackdown in pitcher foreign substances, he has struggled. He's not been very good as of late. So I don't really know where his true talent level lies. If you look at his last few starts here, going against the Cubs last time out, he did have 7 strikeouts, but he also walked 4 hitters. The start before that against the Braves, he pitched 6 innings. He gave up 4 runs. He also gave up a couple of homers. So Tyler Mahle, what are you expecting from him going forward, Adam?
It's tough to say because he does. If you look at on my list of 165 or 164 pitchers that threw at least 25 pitches as a starter prior to June 6th, Tyler Mahle has the 9th biggest drop off in total spin rate. Behind guys like Bauer, Garrett Richards, Bailey Ober. So that's definitely a concern. In the starts he has made since then, he's still struck out 3.8% of hitters, which obviously is really, really good. But he's also walked 9.2%. Prior to June 6th, he had a 28.2% strikeout percentage, 7.8% walk percentage. So I still think he's okay. He's got a 3.13 xFIP in the starts since June 6th. The increase in walk percentage isn't that alarming to me because it's not like this is someone that went from walking like 4% to 9%. He went from like 7.5 to 9. So that could very easily just be, a bad couple of starts anyway. So I still lean towards going to him, but I do think that the book is still kind of out on what we can expect from him going forward because we do see that huge drop off in spin rate since June 6th.
I'm looking something up really quick because I'm thinking about a bet off the top of my head. I'm going to look at what are some of the alternate run lines for the Milwaukee Brewers. If there's a line where it's like the Brewers to score like over 5.5 runs at like plus 300, plus 350, that's actually something that I don't mind taking a stab on. I'm going to look at that afterwards, just because I think if you think about the overall bell curve and just the wide potential just results that we could get from Tyler Mahle here, given the drop in spin rate, the inconsistency as of late, I think the Brewers make sense as a stack. I also think Mahle makes sense as a pitcher. I think this is a really good GPP spot, but also just from a betting standpoint, I think it would make sense to maybe look for an alternate run total for the Milwaukee Brewers and just look for that upside, because I think that if Mahle pitches poorly, I think it could be really bad. So to me, I like Mahle for GPPs. I think there's upside here. I know that people hate when we're hedging or kind of taking a middle ground, but for tournaments, I mean, this is, I think, kind of what we have to do with a lot of these spots. We've seen pitchers over the last few weeks have been so difficult to predict. Mahle's one of the ones that's tough to nail down. So give me both sides of this for tournaments.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And with as far as going to Milwaukee too, like you get the added benefit. One, they're just projected to be under-owned as a stack. 2, Tyler Mahle's getting 37% ownership right now. So if he has a bad start, you're taking advantage of a large percentage of the field. And then also, and this goes back to liking the Tigers as well, everything's relative to the slate that we're talking about. And there's so many good pitchers on this slate that taking some more questionable stacks makes a lot of sense, because outside of Toronto, we don't really have any offense that you're just like, oh yeah, the pitcher they're going against is absolutely terrible. They're likely to have a monster game. It would be surprising if they don't. Most of these games, it's just like, like I'm sure it won't be the case because 1 or 2 pitchers will have a worse start than normal. But most of these games, it's just like, yeah, it's going to be like 5-4 or something like that. So you can get a little bit more creative with your offenses and look a little bit more to just leveraging against popular pitchers like Mahle. So I do like him here. I think if I only had to take one side, I would lean towards him because I do think that he's a little bit underpriced for his strikeout stuff. I think it's a good strikeout matchup, but playing more than one lineup, I think Milwaukee does look like a good spot to get to.
Yeah, and as far as our top stacks, so also the 2 most positively leveraged stacks both come from this game. It is the Cincinnati Reds and the Milwaukee Brewers. So a whole lot of tournament upside here. Now, Adrian Hauser on the other side, not a pitcher I'm considering, but the Reds are definitely a team I want to stack against them. We have them project for less than 4% ownership, and they have 7.2% chance of being the top scoring team.
Yeah, the Reds and the Brewers right now, the 2 best leverage stacks in the top stack tool. 7% chance of being the top stack for Cincinnati, only about 3.9% ownership going there. Adrian Hauser, again, not a bad pitcher, but in the context of this slate, he's certainly one of the weaker pitchers, one of the guys that you can pick on a little bit more. He's done an okay or a pretty good job limiting power. 178 expected ISO to lefties, 141 to righties, but not a very good strikeout pitcher. And the Reds just have a lot of power in this lineup. So with the ownership where it's at, I think Cincinnati looks like one of the best stacks.
Yeah, and I mean, it's once again, I think both offenses in play. As for pitchers, I like Molly. I don't like Hauser, but Molly, rostering him and stacking against him, I think both are really sensible. Last game on the slate here, we have Max Scherzer pitching against Yu Darvish. So I'll ask you this, Adam, because I think without a doubt, these are both pitchers we want to get exposure to. But for a cash game situation, would you feel more comfortable going to Darvish or Scherzer tonight?
Slight edge to Scherzer, I think.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm looking right now first at the ownership projections on FanDuel. We actually have Scherzer project for more than twice the ownership of Darvish. And then on DraftKings, the ownership is about even. That's actually a little weird to me that Scherzer would have 20% ownership compared to 9% Darvish on FanDuel. But then DraftKings, Scherzer and Darvish, where they're basically the same price, they have identical ownership. We do have Scherzer, 31% chance to be a top two pitcher on the slate compared to 24% for Darvish. So it's really close, but our numbers do seem to prefer Scherzer a little bit. But without a doubt, these are two of the better pitchers in baseball, even with a drops in spin rates for both of them. It's not anything that's killing the production for either pitcher.
Yeah. And right now we have Scherzer projected like 2 points higher than Darvish, which, it's not a huge difference. I think that, you're probably talking something like, 52, 48% in favor of Scherzer beating Darvish. But that's why I would lean there in cash. Basically the same price point, a little bit higher projection on Scherzer, but clearly two of the top pitchers on the slate. Scherzer leads the slate with a 35.5% strikeout percentage this year. Darvish is second at 30.6%. xFIP, very good for both of them. They both give up some power. So, in lineups and tournaments where you aren't rostering them, you certainly can, grab a one-off against them. Juan Soto, I think, stands out at 5K going up against Darvish. Obviously, Tatis and Machado can do damage against Scherzer, but just two excellent pitchers here.
And then just final thoughts here. Any interest in stacking against Scherzer or Darvish?
Not really. Like, you can make a case for it in the huge field, top heavy tournaments, just because they will get ownership and because there's not many offenses to really love on this slate. But in anything smaller, like if you're not playing 150 lineups and you're not, even if you are someone that plays 150 lineups, if your strategy is a little bit more risk averse and you're not looking to have like the biggest swings you possibly can in tournaments, it's just a spot where I wouldn't be getting to.
All right, so guys, that does it for the baseball slate. But one final thing before we finish out here is that fantasy football is quickly approaching, and if you trust us with DFS, there's no reason not trust us with season-long and best ball fantasy football teams. The same data analysis that goes into our DFS content tools is now going into fantasy football, and we have plenty in front of the paywall for you to get started. This includes rankings and tons of free articles. That is Lofty and Matt Gajeski. They've been doing that. A couple things you need to know first, though. Go subscribe to the Awesemo Fantasy Football at Awesemo Fantasy on Twitter, as well as use the Awesemo Fantasy Football Facebook page. So, guys, thank you very much for watching. Do us a favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel on the way out. Later on, MLB Deeper Dive, MLB Live Before Lock. You're going to want to watch those, if nothing else, just to really find out what's going on with the weather situation in Toronto and Baltimore, because that game is going to have a whole lot of ownership, going to be really important. So check that out. Also, I'll be on NBA Live Before Lock later tonight with Lofty. But beyond that, good luck today, guys, and Tyler, play us out.